my screens. There you go. Can you see the presentation okay? Fantastic. So as you were told, my name is Anne Paschke and I work at United Network for Organ Sharing. So a lot of people, oh, let's see, my arrows are not working. Give me just a sec, please. There we go. So I want to tell you a little bit about what UNOS is and about the National Transplant System. UNOS is the nonprofit organization that operates the transplant system under a contract with the federal government. The name of the transplant system is Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network. Many people call the OPTN UNOS, and it doesn't matter what you call us. All you really need to know is that this is the organization where volunteers such as yourself serve on committees and a board of directors. Also, those are filled with transplant and donation professionals from around the country. And those people look at the latest medical evidence and make changes to organ allocation policy to make it as fair as possible, and at the same time making it possible for as many people to get organ transplants as possible. So they're balancing utility and justice. As the OPTN, we do a number of things. The things I want to concentrate on with you today are some of the things that kidney patients really need to know about organ allocation policy. So everybody hears about this magic number, right? 20. If your EGFR is at 20 or below, then you can qualify for waiting time. You can also qualify for waiting time on the waiting list when you start dialysis. What a lot of people, even many nephrologists, don't realize is that you do not have to wait until this point to be listed for a transplant. You don't want to wait until you get to this point to go to the transplant center like Sherry's at UPMC to start your evaluation. And there are a couple of reasons for this. Some people are very highly sensitized, which means they don't match with many of the deceased donors that come along. And you can get listed before you start qualifying for dialysis time and still get a match if that organ donor comes along that you match with, if you happen to be one of these people who is highly sensitized. The other way you can get a transplant before you start accruing waiting time on the list is if there is a perfect match. So we all have what are called antigens, and the donor antigens and the candidate antigens are matched by the system. There are 6 of them in particular that are looked like, and if you have matches on all of those, then you will get the offer no matter where you happen to be in the country. So getting listed is something that you want to learn about. Even if you are not totally in end-stage renal disease, you want to consider transplant centers, what works best for you, and get that process started at the right time. When you reach out to a transplant center, they'll let you know what the right time is to come in and start your evaluation process. We also wanted to talk about multiple listing. It is allowed by the OPTN policy for people to list at more than one transplant center. As a matter of fact, when you are evaluated and listed, the transplant centers are required to let you know that this is an option. That does not mean that the center has to participate in multiple listing. Some will only list you if you're only listing at theirs, but they
And
have to list this.
I just want to quickly interrupt if you don't mind. Your slides are not moving, I guess.
They're not?
Yeah, so we
It's,
are still stuck
uh,
on the first page. So
oh
just letting you know.
my goodness, they're moving on. Okay. Sorry, I've been moving them and the wrong screen, I guess. Anyway, with multiple listing, the other thing that you'll need to know before you go to multiple list is um, that some insurances will pay for evaluation at more than one center, but not all of them will. There we go. Now we're going to catch up. Sorry about that. So it's very important to make sure before you start the process of reaching out to a second transplant center for evaluation, it's very important that you check and make sure that your insurance company will pay for that or that you have a way to pay for that. Um, I put a link in here to OPTN policy so that you can look at this if you want to. It's very long, very complicated, and it tells about exactly how the matching is done. So for kidney, um, matching is done on a number of factors. From waiting time primarily is how we match for kidneys. Every person who's waiting for a kidney transplant gets a score, and it indicates how long you're expected to need a kidney compared to the other people who are waiting for one. At the same time, every deceased donor organ that becomes available, every kidney from a deceased donor is also given a score. And that score tells doctors how long that kidney is expected to last um, compared to the other kidneys that become available. So when the organ procurement organization has a deceased donor and they put in all of the medical information about that donor into the OBTN database and they run a match run. The first thing that it does is to rule out everyone who's incompatible with that particular donor. So if you're an incompatible blood type, you won't show up on that list. When the next donor comes along, if you're compatible, you may be at the top of the list. But there are multiple factors that go into where you show up on the list for that particular kidney. When you hear somebody say they're at the top of the list in general, that's a little bit of a misnomer because there is no list until there's a kidney to match. So if you think about a pool of information on the medical information about every person in the country who needs an organ. That's what the waiting list does. And then when that kidney is ready and matched, the system rules out everybody who is not compatible and it ranks everyone else. So the ranking is done on the factors that you can see on your screen. How well you as a candidate match with the donor. If you're a prior living donor, you get some extra preference. The distance from your transplant hospital to the donor hospital is taken into account compared to other people who are also compatible. Pediatric status. Patients who are under the age of 18 get preference, especially for the organs that are expected to last longest. And that brings us to survival benefit. The 80% of kidneys that aren't expected to last as long as the best 20% are waiting time continues to be the primary factor by which those organs are offered to patients. But for the 20% of kidneys that are expected to last longest, those are first offered to the patients who are expected to need them the longest, including pediatric patients. So all of these things go into the matching. It's a very complicated system, and um, I want to go back to some things that Sherry said. The waiting list for a deceased donor kidney is very long, and um, the benefits of living donation are many. Um, so I think it's very important to consider if you're waiting for a kidney, talking to your transplant center about living donation, making sure that's an option for you, um, and starting your search. UNOS has a number of resources for patients. Um, we talked already, I think, about how long your wait is going to be. And it really depends on a lot of things. Um, how long it takes before a candidate comes along if you happen to be highly sensitized. If you have the most common blood type, you actually wait longer because you can only take organs from that blood type. Some transplant centers accept more organs than others, and it will accept different patients as well. So Sherry told you about the evaluation process, and sometimes patients aren't listed. It is possible to go get evaluated at another center that, in some cases, will um, accept candidates for transplantation who are sicker than others. They have different practices, so it's worth at least calling around. But the same thing is true on the other end. Some transplant centers, some doctors will consider transplanting kidneys that others wouldn't. It's very important to also talk to your transplant center about what you want out of transplant and what kind of organs you're willing to accept. If you're willing to accept an organ that might not last as long, you could get it faster in many cases than if you don't, if you're not interested in those organs. Um, so those resources that I was talking about, there are a few websites that you should know about. The OPTN website not only has policy, but it has a wealth of data. There's a tool that you can go and use to pull transplant data about any of the transplants that are performed in the United States. You can look at the different centers and how many transplants they do. Then you can go to srtr.org. That is another government contractor who takes the OPTN data and uses it to compare transplant centers. If you were choosing between centers, you could bring up the results at the specific ones you're looking at and compare them against each other. UNOS also has patient services. If you have questions about the transplant system, you can call or email them. They are there from 8 to 5 Eastern every day, but they are very busy. So if you happen to call and get the recording, please leave a message and they'll call you back. And then I also want to point out that in Richmond, Virginia, I know some of you are in Baltimore, so you're not that far away. There's a National Donor Memorial. Jamie has been, and she can tell you what a special place it is. I would love to give anyone a tour who would like to come visit. But if you're not close to Richmond, Virginia, you can go online to the UNOS website and take a virtual tour and get a flavor for what that's like. So those are the things that I was asked to talk about today. So with that, I will send it back over to Bobby.
I thank you very much. Lots of information there, and we do have a few questions. We're going to take a few questions here, and then we're going to have to move forward. Any questions that don't get answered, like I said before, we're going to respond to your questions, and we'll do that by way of a follow-up email to everybody. The first question that I'd like to present would be going to Sherry. Sherry, we had a question come in that they wanted to know, why do they stop testing living donors if we have possible candidates? Can you elaborate on that for us just for a little briefly and give us some feedback?
Course. So again, every transplant center does things differently. We test one living donor, we evaluate one living donor at a time for each recipient. And that is because we are fortunate to see that people have campaigns that go viral. Sometimes we have a person who has 400 people register all in one day. Obviously, it's not fair for us to backlog the whole system and test those 400 people and let everybody else's donors, not be able to get an appointment with us. So we go one by one. The other thing I will say behind the scenes is that we do have people who register and they are not eligible, or they change their mind when they learn a little bit more. Maybe they can't get time off of work. Maybe their family isn't supportive. We also have a high percentage of people that register because they have really good intentions, but when the time comes to talk with our team and get an evaluation scheduled, we just never hear back from them. And so, because of HIPAA, we are not allowed to share that information. You might have people that say, like, yeah, of course, I'll look into living donation, and they don't actually register. So I think there can be a bit of a disconnect between what sometimes people are told versus what is actually happening on the back end.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We had another question come in regarding specifically UPMC participating in a program or a research called Fast Track Evaluation. And the question there is do you see that, can you explain what Fast Track Evaluation is? And do you see that possibly being moved out or expanding to donors as well, and adopting it nationwide?
Absolutely. So I'd like to shout out my colleague, Camille Cesari, who actually looked this up for me. I started in 2019, so it was just after this study had ended. Also, Dr. Nirav Shah is with us today, and I'm sure he can speak to this a little bit later too. But this is the process that we still have in place. What we do is we have a one-day evaluation where the person who's interested in transplant meets with a transplant surgeon, nephrologist, coordinator, pharmacist, insurance reviewer, social worker, behavioral health, dietitian, and they also get their echocardiogram, electrocardiogram, chest x-rays, CT scan, blood work, and urinalysis. So I mentioned we have a bit of a marathon. We get it all banged out in one day. And yes, we've actually been doing the exact same thing on the donor side. I was a donor last year. I showed up for one day in the hospital and I met with the full team, got all my scans and labs drawn, peed in the cup, did the whole shebang. That was on a Wednesday. The following Wednesday, I got approval by the selection team and was ready to schedule my transplant. So we get them in for one long day and they're done. And the outcomes are tremendous because a lot of people don't feel comfortable driving into the big city. They might be traveling from across the country. And so we want to get it all handled as quickly as possible and put less strain on our donors and recipients.
Great, thank you. That's great. I appreciate that clarification. Moving on, Anne, we have a few questions that came in here for you as well. First of all, what I'd like you to do for the benefit of people all over the country, can you please explain to them what the benefit is of listing or trying to get listed outside of their own local region or their local location?
So the way that organs were allocated previously were first they would go to local people in the local donor service area of the OPO in which the donor was recovered. And after that, they would be allocated to people in the OPTN region. But that has changed now the way that the organs are allocated as far as distance from the transplant hospital to the recipient hospital is by a circle around the donor hospital. So within 250 nautical miles first, they're looking at somebody. So it used to be very cut and dry that it was beneficial to list in more than one OPO donor service area. That's not the case anymore. And that circle